False poverty tactics. Why folks pretended to have less just to stay safe back in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, survival, well, it wasn't just about finding food or work. It was about perception. Plain and simple. What your neighbors believed about you could determine whether your home was left alone or quietly targeted, whether you received help or resentment, whether you stayed invisible or became a liability. Across the United States and beyond, millions of families learned a hard lesson that still applies today. Appearing poor could be safer than appearing stable. This wasn't about pride or shame, it was about security. In an era of widespread desperation, visible resources made you vulnerable. People who seemed to have more were watched, judged, and sometimes punished, socially or even violently. Those who survived the longest often did so by blending in, minimizing their footprint, and deliberately understating what they had. What follows is not folklore. It is a pattern documented in letters, court records, oral histories, and relief agency reports. These were deliberate, calculated survival tactics that modern audiences rarely discuss, yet they remain relevant in any period of economic instability. Concealment of assets became a first line of defense. Families who retained savings or valuable goods learned quickly that open ownership invited attention. Cash was not kept in banks once bank failures became common, but it also was not discussed. Folks hid money in walls, buried jars under garden beds, or broke savings into multiple locations so no single loss would be catastrophic. What mattered most was not possession, but secrecy. Farmers who had stored up grain or preserved food, well, they made sure to avoid having any visible stockpiles. Most folks kept their pantries looking pretty modest on the surface. Any extra food was tucked away in cellars, behind false walls, or out in the outbuildings. You see, if outsiders thought you were just barely getting by, you were a lot less likely to face theft, or pressure to share, or even scrutiny from the local authorities who were out there distributing relief. Applied to today, the principle is, actually pretty simple. Resilience gets a whole lot better when your resources are diversified, decentralized, and well kept discreet. Broadcasting your preparedness just invites dependency and resentment when times get scarce. Clothing and outward appearance were often deliberately downgraded. Many families, they actually owned better clothing than what they wore out in public. Folks would wear their work clothes until they were just about threadbare, even if they had replacements at home. Shoes got patched over and over again. Coats were handed down and even altered to look older than they really were. Now, this wasn't always because new clothing was unavailable. Sometimes it was just that visible comfort suggested you might have hidden means. Folks understood that, well, appearing just a little worse off than the average neighbor could really ease social friction. It kinda discouraged those borrowing requests you just couldn't turn down without stirring up trouble. It also helped cut down on gossip and, kept expectations nice and low. In these small towns where everyone kept a close eye on each other, looking modest was almost like camouflage. The modern parallels, they're pretty obvious if you think about it. In uncertain times, blending right into the economic baseline is usually a whole lot safer than showing off any kind of surplus. Homes were kept up just enough to look ordinary, not really improved. Families would hold off on repairs even if they actually could afford to fix things up. Fresh paint, new windows, or any kind of visible upgrade, those things drew attention. A house that looked well-maintained suggested stability, and stability hinted at resources. And resources, well, that implied obligation. Some families even allowed fences to sag or porches to weather deliberately. Inside the home, conditions could be far better than what passers-by assumed. Privacy was preserved by lowering expectations. For contemporary survivalists, this reinforces a critical lesson. Security is not only physical, it is social. What others believe about your capacity matters as much as what you actually possess. Income sources were downplayed or disguised. Those who found steady work often concealed it. Side income from repairs, sewing, food sales, or bartering was rarely discussed openly. People learned to appear underemployed even when they were not. This reduced the risk of being reported for tax issues, pressured for loans, or accused of exploiting the crisis. It also protected relationships. Resentment destroys cooperation, and cooperation was essential for survival. The application today is restraint. Not every success needs to be visible, not every advantage should be public. Food practices were intentionally modest in public view. Cooking smells carried. Families avoided preparing rich meals during daylight hours. Meat was cooked late at night. Baking was staggered. Sharing leftovers openly could create rumors that you had more than others. This behavior is documented repeatedly in rural and urban accounts. Folks understood that hunger, well, it sharpened awareness. Just one visible advantage could, isolate a household. Modern preparedness. It follows the same logic. Operational security applies to food just as much as it does to tools or supplies. Social behavior, in a way, reinforced the illusion of scarcity. Families took part in community hardship narratives even when they were privately stable. They'd complain when needed, express worry, and steer clear of looking too optimistic. Optimism, well, it suggested insulation from hardship, and that made others uncomfortable. Now, this wasn't about deception for personal gain. It was really more about alignment for safety. Folks who stood out too much socially, well, they were often ostracized, and in some severe cases, they could even be targeted for theft or violence. Even in modern crises, social alignment is still a real survival skill. Standing apart emotionally can be just about as dangerous as standing apart when it comes to material things. Mutual aid, it really worked best when any imbalance stayed invisible. Folks with resources often helped out quietly. There were anonymous food drops, quiet barter, and even indirect assistance through churches or third parties. If you were too publicly generous, it marked you as someone capable of giving, and before long, that became more of an expectation than a choice. The lesson is subtle but important. Sustainable generosity depends on discretion. False poverty protected dignity as much as safety. Appearing equally burdened preserved relationships. It avoided hierarchies that fracture communities. In the 1930s, survival depended on neighbors. No one wanted to be seen as above or below the group. This tactic was not cowardice, it was strategic humility. What this teaches modern survivalists and historians is pretty clear. The Great Depression shows us that survival isn't just about stockpiling or accumulating stuff. It's really about perception management, Folks who managed to endure the longest, well, they mastered restraint, discretion, and a good bit of social awareness. Today, whether we're facing economic downturns, supply shocks, or even some kind of localized instability, the same principles still hold true. Visibility creates vulnerability. Silence, well, it preserves flexibility. And blending in, that right there protects your options. History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but, human behavior under stress is just remarkably consistent. If this kind of analysis matters to you, if you value hard lessons drawn from real human experience rather than just theory, then, well, you already belong here. Subscribe to Battlefield of Survival, share this with others who take history seriously, and stay ready by learning from those who survived when nothing was guaranteed.